you have your Bibles or a device with a Bible on it, I'd encourage you to turn to Genesis 16. We have John coming to lead us through reading the Bible for us this morning. Thanks, John.
Thank you. As John said, I'm reading today from God's Word, Genesis chapter 16. Commencing at verse 1. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed with Sarai and said, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said to Hagar, slave of Sarai, "Where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I now have seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Beer-lahai-roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar was bore him Ishmael. May God speak to us through his word and Andrew.
Well, we're fortunate that we've already had the Old Testament storyline mentioned, and I think I heard John offer for Chantel to give me a few tips on how that goes, so I'm looking forward to that. I've been thinking about storylines and how they go because it's good for us to have all of our kind of story sensitivities turned on for reading a story like the story of Hagar. It's like a single scene in a stage play, right? You know, it's sort of got its open and close, and lots of things are being signalled to us so that we notice what's happening with characters, and we notice what's happening with storyline, and we notice kind of developments in the story. And I was thinking about what kind of story this is, because they talk about story arcs. There was a famous novel that I studied when I was in high school, and it's a bit funny how I came to study it because well, as a parent, you're always wondering how interventionist to be in your children's lives, right? You know, you're always wondering, should I have kind of inserted myself here more to stop such and such a happening? You know, your kids tell you something that they experienced later on, and you sort of went, "Oh, I didn't mean for them to experience that at that age," or whatever. Well, my mum was the kind of person who wouldn't leave these things in any kind of doubt. And so I would be in high school and I would discover that I was scheduled to study something different from all the other kids because my mum thought the existing curriculum was too violent, etc., right? So I studied this book when nobody else did because the other scheduled text was too violent and worldly in my mother's eyes. So I studied Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And what was interesting about this story was that it follows the story arc of a rise, fall and rise. So the chief character starts in very humble circumstances and then ascends to greater and greater privilege. His name's Pip, and that's the key character. He starts out very, very humble, modest circumstances. He comes into money by some mysterious source. He thinks he knows what is going on, and he lives increasingly privileged kind of life. And then he discovers the money's not coming from where he thought. The expectations that he'd had for his future were misconceived, and what he imagined his future was going to be was not coming, and in fact the money source dries up, and pretty soon he's plunged into very, very humble circumstances. He has to apologise to all the people that he's treated with contempt as he thinks he's entitled, and he has to sort of climb from a low trough sort of back to a midpoint. And they talk about that as one of the main 6 story arcs that exist in storylines. So almost any movie you can watch, almost any book you can read tends to follow one of a few different trajectories of the main character. And they call this one a Cinderella story, a rise, a fall, and then a rise. And others are relentless rises, relentless falls. There's one called A Man in a Hole that's an instant kind of drastic crisis and then slow ascent out of that. But none of these story arcs quite describe any particular story. Each one is kind of unique and does something interesting with the trajectory. So rather than me just kind of blow all surprises and tell you which story arc I think the Hagar story is, I'll just say it's good to have our minds switched on to that kind of thing. So just like a modern story, our ancient writer has the ability to tell us about characters and character development, has the ability to tell us about plot lines and can chart stories of rising tension and falling tension and crisis points and turning points when everything changes. All that is the kind of thing we need to be looking for. And the writer of Genesis is very clever, so can sort of wave little flags for us. Some of the things we should be noticing maybe as we get started in the Hagar story is both Abram and Sarah have their old names that they have in Genesis. They don't yet have the names Abraham and Sarah, so we had Sarai correctly and Abram. So that already is a little indicator to us that these characters are going to go through changes in their character that are reflected in the changes in their names. So they're destined to be changed, and we're finding them pretty early in their character development, right? The fact that their names haven't changed tells us there's more to come for them. They're still learning. There's something that's not fully developed. There's a change that's got to happen for them to be the kind of fully fledged characters that they are at the end. So we're ready for that. We're ready to not expect maybe tip-top performance from Sarai and Abram. And in fact, we're going to discover that Abram is going to take something of a backseat in the storyline. His name is just about the very first word, it is, I think, in the Hebrew. The very first word in the chapter is Abram's name. No, very first word is Sarah's name in the chapter, and the very last word is going to be Abram's. But in between, the main character is actually going to be this unexpected character, Hagar. There are a few surprises built in there because Hagar is Egyptian, and Egypt is the unnamed nation that's going to oppress the Israelites in the dream that Abram has in the previous chapter. So Abram's given a kind of, he has an encounter with God, and at first the promise is about how many offspring he's going to have, and then the focus quickly shifts to the land, and the problem of the land is Abram's standing in it, but he doesn't really have any traction on it. The storyline prior to this has him kind of reaching the land in chapter 12, and I just think of someone who runs onto a skating rink, right? He kind of charges into Canaan from Mesopotamia, and like someone with an inability to control their skates, he just kind of skates clear through and out the other side, and a few verses later he's in Egypt. And this problem of how they're going to get any traction on the land that they are staying in like temporary dwellers is the big problem of those first 4 chapters, chapters 12, 13, 14 and 15. They're moving around in the promised land and there's an expectation they're going to have this land. But for the time being, they just kind of skate around on top of it and they can't get much purchase on it. So the land is the big issue there in those first 4 chapters of the Abraham stories, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then there's a hint of the oppression that's coming in Egypt. So there's a word for oppression that's used in chapter 15, what Egypt is going to do to Israel, or proto-Israel. That word's going to be kind of turned on its head in chapter 16, because Egypt won't be doing the oppressing in chapter 16, and Egyptian will be suffering the oppression. But the same word group is used. So Hagar, the Egyptian, is going to be oppressed by the chosen family. It's going to be oppressed by Sarah. So that's a bit of a turnabout. Sometimes oppressors can turn into the oppressed. Sometimes the oppressed can turn into oppressors. That does happen. So as we get to chapter 16, we're in a situation now where the focus is shifting off the land and the question of how we're going to get this offspring promise to ever be fulfilled is the chief challenge of Genesis 16 through 22. Okay, if this nation's going to be great, that promise of the beginning of chapter 12, well, to have a nation you need people, and where are the people coming from if there's this barrenness and inability to have children in the family as well? So with those little tips and indicators given to us, I might just work my way through the passage, adding one critical ingredient, and just talk us through some of the things that I've seen in the text that seem interesting to me. So we've had the setup that the chief obstacle to the realisation of the promises of God at the moment is Sarah's barrenness, Sarah's infertility. In those days, I think the woman was typically blamed whether it was the man's problem or the woman's, but I guess it must be hers in this case because Abram is able to father a child by Hagar. So perhaps it is in this case. So Sarah has a suggestion. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. We should touch on the word slave. In Hebrew it's shifkar, and this is actually not the word for, it's not a really base word for slave. It's actually the kind of word for a chief maid, like someone with responsibility in the household. I went looking for an analogy and my travels led me into Downton Abbey. So this is a bit of a foreign country for me, so I trod carefully. But there are figures in there who have that kind of responsibility, right? There's sort of a chief maid to the lady of the house. And so she's not just... And there's another character, like I was looking for rise, fall, rise stories, right? And there was the suggestion that there's 2 characters in Downton Abbey that are like this. One of them is the girl who starts out as scullery maid and then kind of eventually educates herself and climbs in the world. And then there's the other one who is a very reliable, sturdy character and becomes the lady of the house's, attendant woman. There's a name for that. I forget what it is. And if you've watched Downton Abbey, you probably know what it is. Hagar's kind of a combo of those. She's actually probably risen to a position of responsibility, but the fact that she is a maidservant probably means that she emerged from hard circumstances. Be interesting to know what brought her out of Egypt. So it's not a base word, right? It's actually a word with some dignity in the household. Perhaps I can build a family through her, says Sarah. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. Now, I'm not really a marriage counsellor, and especially I don't think that if I was a marriage counsellor, I would try and counsel people who'd had their diamond jubilee already, the diamond anniversary when I've only had my silver. But I'm pretty sure Abram shouldn't have agreed there, and I think it's going to come back to bite him, right? This is just my kind of instincts as a husband. Verse 3, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, and we're very conscious of how time is passing, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, or this like maidservant, slightly more dignified than slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Now, the word behind despise actually has a bit of history in Genesis as well. It doesn't turn up very much. It means something like belittle. And so it's used a couple of different ways. In Genesis 8, where the flood starts to kind of wane, where the water level drops, this same verb is used. The flood kind of belittles, right? The flood drops. It's exactly the same word, kalal. And then God promises in Genesis 8:21, in reassurance after this great disaster, I'll never again kind of belittle the earth as I've done, or belittle the land, or diminish its growing power. This word turns up there again. Now it's not water level. Now it's about diminishing the earth's power to sustain life. And then it occurs one more time. In the promise to Abram in Genesis 12, one of the last lines is, those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse, something like that. But two different words are used, and the first one is those who belittle you, those who diminish you, those who kind of impinge upon your rights or impinge upon your well-being. That's the last time the word was used before this. So if we actually track that word through, Hagar's now at risk of treading on the toes of the family that God has chosen to favour. See? Now that she has conceived and her mistress Sarai hasn't, she's starting to feel entitled. She's starting to feel like she's got one up on her mistress. Maybe she's kind of rubbing that in her face a little bit. And so she's actually becoming a bit guilty of this kind of infraction, this problem, where God has said, I'll be watching that no one belittles or diminishes the family that I've chosen to bless. So Hagar's at risk, in a sense, of being in the wrong here. So when Sarai mistreats Hagar, verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Now, I'm not a marriage counsellor, but if Abram hesitated for just a moment here and went to go, I'd be like, don't bother, fella. It's not worth it. You won't get anywhere. So he takes the opposite option. Maybe if he restrains himself there, maybe his 60 plus years of married experience told him not to speak up for his, not to say anything like, I thought it was your idea. He doesn't. He's been married 60 years. So he says, your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. So he's probably gone a bit too far the other way here. Abram's pretty passive in this chapter, and he actually, we would say, modern English translation, throws Hagar under the bus. Right? He's left her to it. And he is involved in the situation. So he's avoided all responsibility here. So Sarai mistreated Hagar, and so she fled from her. So that's one of our key words, mistreat. This is this word for oppression. This is the word that was used in the forecast of the Egyptian captivity in the end of chapter 15. Same word, right? The oppression that the Israelites are going to suffer from the Egyptians maidservant suffers from her mistress. Sarai mistreated Hagar, and so she fled. Now, this is going to sound like Elijah in the desert in 1 Kings 19, isn't it? The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. There's probably none of us in the room, even if we've looked into Old Testament storylines, that have much of an idea where Shur is, although it'd be interesting if you've got a Bible map or something there. What it tells us is that Hagar's headed home. Shur is a waypoint, it's probably a border post on the way to Egypt. So she's an Egyptian maid, she's homeless, she's on the run, she's thinking about her options. She's like that person who's escaping a bad situation, is on the bus and is just figuring out what's the one place I can go with the best prospect of help. So she's headed home. She's going back to Egypt. And like the Lord meeting Elijah in the desert and saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? The Lord addresses Hagar in verse 8. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? It's kind of a traveller question, but this has a couple of things that are unique about them. I read in a commentary, so hold this lightly. This is something we all have to go and check to the extent that we can. This commentator said that this is the only place anywhere in ancient Near Eastern literature where a god speaks directly to a woman. The only place. So that's such a grand claim that I feel like I would like to just keep checking that. But that's enormous, right? The only place in all ancient Near East stories, which go way beyond our Old Testament, the only place where a deity speaks to a woman, especially by name, especially to name her. That's really unique. The flip side of that is she's going to name him. And this is the only place in the Old Testament where anyone names God. So this is unexpected, isn't it? This is not the person we would expect to be dignified with the only kind of revelation to a woman in ancient Near Eastern literature and the only character given the privilege of naming God, in a sense. Taking the privilege, receiving the privilege of naming God. They're really unique things. She does not have a lot going for her as in social standing terms. So she's female in a male-dominated society. She's a slave or in the serving class in a class society, like so many. And she's a foreigner in the family. She's from another nation. Lots of cultures are really good at despising foreigners, right? So she has 3 marks against her. And in this storyline, what's worse, she really has a fourth thing. And that is she's a runaway slave. Runaway slaves faced really severe penalties in the ancient world, right? I can't remember what the penalties were. I think in some cases it was regarded as a capital offence. So Babylonians, Assyrians, different cultures, they had laws about this. To be a runaway slave was really viewed very negatively in a slave-owning society. So she really had 4 things against her here. And so this is the most striking thing in the whole text, that the angel of the Lord, which is a fascinating... How to explain this? Every commentary will say, the angel of the Lord kind of is and kind of isn't God at the same time. Kind of speaks for God, and then the person will say in multiple stories, I've seen God and lived. Even though the angel of the Lord will speak almost as a representative for God. We've just got to hold those things together. So the angel of the Lord visits her in the desert, this lost young woman, and says, go back. One of 3 things, 3 statements in a row. The Hebrew starts exactly the same in verses 9, 10 and 11. First message is not an easy message. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. So our commentators say, okay, it's fair to say that God cares for and has an eye on the oppressed, but sometimes God says to the oppressed person, for my reasons, for my purposes, I need you to stay where you are for the time being. So there's a difficult tension there, isn't there? God here notices a person who is oppressed, notices someone who is suffering, notices her suffering, and notices her when socially nobody else might, when she might be completely overlooked. But he doesn't say, I'm going to save you from your hard situation. He actually asks her, commands her, to return to it in this setting. That wouldn't be a universal rule, right? I wouldn't apply that universally. But this is what is asked from Hagar. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. She does have something of Abram's, right? She's carrying his child. So if she runs away to Egypt, there's greater consequences than just her own well-being or her own recovery. She's actually carrying a child from the chosen family, and that places special responsibility on her. So that's the first statement. For now, brackets, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The word is a bit stronger than submit. It really kind of says, let her treat her how she's treating you. Let her treat you how she's treating you. you will have to keep copping it. That's really the sense of the word there. It's that word for oppress, once again, only it's let yourself be oppressed. That's pretty hard, isn't it? It might be hard for you to swallow. Second statement in verse 10, the angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. This is going to be a promise made to Abraham, or Abram, in the next chapter. Hagar actually hears it before Abram does. So the first person promised abundant descendants. It's a double-barreled verb, like I'm going to super multiply your descendants. Hagar hears that from God before Abram ever does. So we've had her facing the prospect of having to go back to a hard situation in verse 9, but now she gets a promise that's going to apply to Abram even before he ever sees it. I'm going to abundantly multiply your children. So much they'll be too numerous to count. Abram's had a hint of that in verse 15, sand on the seashore, but it's really coming more in chapter 17. Third statement, verse 11, the angel of the Lord also said to her, reaffirming what she knows, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael. You will call his name Ishmael, Shemo Ishmael. You will call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. The misery is that word for oppression again. It's the last time that it turns up in this chapter. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. Hagar will be like, I think that's good news. I'm not 100% certain. It could mean he'll be a wild donkey of the desert country. The word for man there is very similar to the word for ground or countryside. So it could be like a wild donkey of the wilderness. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And I wish I could read that to you in Hebrew, because it's this nifty little saying. He's going to be perpetually in conflict with those around him. He'll live in hostility toward all his brothers, or he'll live just to the east of all his brothers. He'll live right in their faces. There's a few things that could mean, probably means all of them. So he's going to be one of those people who just rubs everyone up the wrong way and will be in kind of perpetual conflict with them. I don't know how encouraged she feels after that one. She's had a discouraging word. You have to go back to your hard situation. She's had a really encouraging word. You're going to have more offspring than you can count. And then this son you're going to have, he's going to be a wild man. So now that's kind of an in-between word. I'm not sure how she feels about that. Verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. The only person in Genesis who does this. You are the God who sees me, for I have now seen the one who sees me. El Roi, the God of my seeing. It's kind of two meanings, the God I have seen and the God who has seen me. The emphasis a little bit earlier was on God hearing her suffering, but now the emphasis is on the seeing. And so that gives its name to the well. It's called Bir Laharoi, the well of the living one who sees me. And obviously the reader knows where that is and can still place it out there in the desert toward Egypt. In the gap between 14 and 15, she's gone home, evidently, because 15 says, Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. How would Abram know what the child's name was supposed to be? He must have listened to Ishmael. Listen to Hagar about the name Ishmael. So twice in the chapter, Abram has listened to the voice of his wife. He's listened to the voice of his wife, Sarai, early in the chapter, and this time he's listened to the voice of his kind of new wife, functionally at least, Hagar, and given the God-given name to his son, Ishmael, which means God hears. God hears. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Sarai is out of the picture here temporarily, and Abram's well in it because his name is the last word in the chapter, and it's going to be the second word in the new chapter, which will restore us to the bigger storyline. So this episode in the storyline, which the larger storyline's really about Abram, but this episode's been focused on Hagar, who gets an unexpected amount of attention. So we can think of a few women who got God's attention against the odds and oftentimes were kind of incorporated into the family lines in the biblical stories, right? We can think of Tamar coming later in Genesis. We can think of Rahab early in Joshua. And then we can think of Ruth. And they're all a bit unexpected, and those last three all turn up in the genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew. So in a clearly patriarchal society, these women appear and get kind of an unexpected prominence, an unexpected role. You could imagine Genesis working without Genesis 16. You could imagine Hagar's little episode not even happening and not doing sort of too much damage to the storyline. So isn't it interesting that she gets the focus here temporarily and just really seems to bring home to us that God has the ability to notice the person without much notice in the cards that they hold socially, right? That the way, what life has dealt to them in ordinary terms, their fortunes, how well they're going, how much credit they would get from the people around them. Hagar doesn't hold very many cards in her social situation. She doesn't hold many cards, but constantly through Genesis and beyond in the storyline, God seems to ignore how many cards people hold. If the eldest son seems to hold the trump card, God will favour the younger son and give them a bigger role in the storyline. If the men naturally hold the trump cards, God seems to surprisingly sometimes favour the women and give them a moment in the sun. Or the children when the adults matter. The slaves when the free people matter. And so Hagar, against the odds, gets that unexpected attention in this chapter. And she discovers she's seen and heard by God, but she also discovers that being noticed by God doesn't automatically get her out of her immediate difficulties. So her flight, well, we might do things like that, in our lives to avoid hard situations. But sometimes, even in the will of God, we actually have to be in the hard situation. Now, I'm not over-extrapolating that, right? I'm not saying that means, women should stay in a violent situation or what have you, It's very hard to comment in theory on these things. But sometimes we're in a situation like Hagar's where we have to, for the sake of God's larger plan, suffer what we're suffering at the moment. Even the fact that God notices our suffering, notices our hardship, doesn't mean that we're exempt from it. Doesn't mean that there's an immediate way out of it. Part of God's plan for his blessed family was for Ishmael to be raised in the household. And there was more hardship to come, right? So in chapter 21, which is the pigeon pair, the partner passage for this text, Hagar and Ishmael will be leaving and they'll be on the road again. And Hagar will be wondering again how to stay alive. And Hagar will again encounter God. And whereas God sent her back home in this chapter, in chapter 21, he's going to effectively be behind her journey away from home. So there's more hardship coming in her story. But apart from maybe Jacob encountering God, at Bethel on the way out for his journey into Syria and then encountering God on the way home, it's such an unusual, special thing that Hagar encounters God in her suffering. Such an unexpected person having such an unexpected meeting. So, some of you might be facing those situations that you can't actually escape for now. I think of things like chronic illness. I think of things like protracted relationship difficulties. In my wife's family, there was an estranged relationship that lasted 15 years or so. Someone very close to my wife in her family was estranged for so long that our kids grew up not recognising her, didn't know who she was. Those kinds of things are not easily solved sometimes, right? Those things, just because we feel like we've got God's attention, doesn't mean necessarily that the difficulty, that we can be exempted from the difficulty. Some of those things are born, right? We all know someone, maybe you are someone who's born chronic illness lifelong. It still seems to matter to me that God notices, God hears, and God sees even the person suffering that oppressive situation. Hears and sees Hagar in her oppressive situation. Maybe that's a model in the larger story where this little person could have been overlooked and forgotten and not noticed. A sign of God's attention that's not based on aptitude and qualifications and social standing and achievements, but entirely really based in the character of God and God's ability to notice every person that He's made. So, one episode in the story, but an episode that has a very important role, something I think we each can find encouraging. Not many of us are, presidents and prime ministers, that level of importance. Pyramids have little peaks and they have massive bases, right? So there are not many blocks up the top. There are a lot of blocks down the bottom. God notices the little blocks, the base blocks. Very good at doing that. And so I hope you can take some encouragement from that this morning. Thanks.